Yo everybody, Taylor Torrance here from Cosmic Academy, and today we are talking about something that is really fundamental and important to keep top of mind all the way throughout the production, mixing, and mastering phases of our song creation process. When I think about myself, this has become really second nature for me, but when I think about how often I really do put this concept into practice, it's every couple of minutes throughout the entire creation process. So it really is that important. And what we're talking about today is volume matching. So what does that mean? Every time we apply processing to an instrument, a group, or even an entire master, it changes not only the sonic characteristics of the signal, but it also changes the volume. And if we don't manually, or in some cases automatically, if we have the right plugins, adjust for that volume change, we can easily trick ourselves into thinking that something sounds better because it's louder, and not necessarily because of the actual changes that the processing is doing to the signal. So I want to jump into Ableton, show you guys just a quick lesson on, why or how we perceive things that are louder to be better, and then also some ways that we can continually sort of volume adjust things as we apply compression and EQ. And then I also want to show you in the context of mixing and mastering, as we're comparing against reference tracks, why it's important to volume match there. So some really important ways that we need to keep this concept in mind throughout all of these processes, and I'm excited to show you guys. So let's jump into Ableton and get started. All right, guys, so here we are in Ableton. This is a future house project that I put together. I like to use this project for concepts like this because there's not too much going on here, so we can focus more on the concept as opposed to what's going on in the broader context of the song. And what I want to start with is the concept I was talking about in the intro of this video, which is that we tend to perceive things that are louder as sounding better. And how I want to demonstrate that first is with this compressor that I have here on the master channel. So this is the Waves SSL comp. It's a great compressor plugin, bus compressor plugin. If you haven't checked it out, check this one out for sure. And what I want to do is just let the whole song play. I'm going to turn this plugin off and turn it back on. And as I do so, listen to the track and not let me know, but think about what sounds better as I A/B with this plugin on and off. All right, so it obviously sounds better when the plugin's on, right? And of course, you may have been able to guess, there's no compression happening in this plugin right now. I've cranked the threshold all the way to the max, so we are getting 0 gain reduction. And what I've done is I've just turned the makeup gain up by 5 dB, so that when I turn this plugin on, all we're doing is just turning the track up by 5 decibels. And of course, it sounds better because it's louder. And that just goes to show this phenomenon that happens with volume changes. And so with compression, the best way to take care of this problem is to adjust the makeup gain so that it's the same as the average gain reduction that we're getting in the compressor. So I'm going to turn that makeup gain down to 0. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to pull this threshold down as the track plays until we're getting, between 3 and 4 decibels of gain reduction. And then I'll turn the makeup gain to adjust or compensate for the gain reduction that we're getting out of the compressor, so that we're basically canceling out the volume change effect component of this plugin and focusing, or able to focus, only on the changes to the dynamics and the transients that the compressor is actually doing to the signal. So I'm going to do that live now, and then we will listen again to the A/B. All right, so as you can see, just getting about just under 4 decibels of gain reduction. And so I have turned this back up to about 3.4. And so again, we're canceling out the volume change component. Now, when I turn this plugin on and off, the change is going to be much more subtle. Listen for the difference in the kick in the transient, the punchiness of the mix, and the stereo, not stereo separation, but the instrument separation that happens when I turn the compressor on. Now we're listening for what the compressor is doing and not just the volume change. Take a listen. So you can hear that difference mostly in the kick, but it's a lot more subtle, and that's because we've eliminated the volume change component. That is, I think, kind of one of the best examples of how this works in the compression point of view on a whole mix. Now let's jump into a specific instrument in a slightly different context and show you another example of this phenomenon. All right, so I want to show you guys another example of the same concept. And this is another area of the mixing process where you can really be susceptible to this sort of trick that louder equals better. This is in the context of EQ. Listen real quick to this instrument that I have here. This is the main pluck melody in the track. So obviously that's one of the most important components of this track that I have here. And I have this EQ set up here on this, this instrument. Now, right now I've got nothing on it. And, just briefly, of course, I'll touch on what an EQ does. Obviously I can select a node here. I can boost specific portions of the frequency spectrum, or I can attenuate them as well, take them down. And think about what that's doing. As opposed to the volume knob here on the right side that we have within our DAW that just changes the volume of the entire instrument, this you can think of an EQ as a volume slider for a particular portion of the frequency spectrum. But ultimately what it's doing is it's turning up or down a portion of the frequencies. And so, the EQ can provide a similar opportunity for us to trick ourselves into thinking that louder equals better. Because if something, for instance, is too quiet, if I take this instrument and turn it down, we can easily start turning portions of the frequency spectrum up, which might make it sound, make ourselves think it's sounding better because we're just turning it back up. But those EQ moves might not be the right EQ moves for what the sound actually calls for. Here, I'll just do this real quick. Okay, so obviously when I turn the EQ off, this sounds better, even though it actually is a horrible EQ move for this sound, right? Like we would never want to boost something 20 dB here at, 2000 Hertz or whatever. That is not the right call for this sound, but because we don't have our volume set properly, we can trick ourselves in this way. And so, this just goes to show another way that we have to be careful in volume adjusting the changes we make to make sure that we're hearing the changes and not just the volume changes. So let me show you how to do that here in this EQ. So if I reset this volume slider here at the right, watch where we're hitting as I just play through the instrument. Okay, so we're peaking about -13. You can see here indicated here on the slider. And if I were to just do a high shelf boost here, this is not going to sound great, but let's just do a high shelf boost of 9. It's going to go louder than -13. Check it out. See, now we're hitting -8.6, right? So I turn this back off. Back again, this is even it changed a little bit. This is -15. So this high shelf in this EQ move makes the whole track louder by about 6 dB. And so what we need to do, and this is every plugin or most plugins do offer this functionality, we need to turn this down by about 6 dB, right, to compensate, just like we did with the compressor, for this EQ move that we're making. So let's see where we're peaking now that I've made this compensation in the output. Cool, so we're back to negative 15. If I turn this off and turn this node off, negative 15, right? So now we are comparing apples to apples when we turn that plugin on. So I'll turn this node back on. I'll turn this back down to negative 6. And so now when we turn the plugin on and off, we're hearing the difference in what the EQ is actually doing to the sound, not the volume difference. Take a listen. You hear how the sound is getting super bright when I turn the EQ on, but it's not getting louder. You can hear that the volumes are about the same. And so this is another aspect, in the EQ context of why it's important to volume match when we're making these changes. And you can watch using a volume meter. By the way, if you're using a plugin that doesn't have an output knob like this, you can always pull in a utility or any type of just simple gain plugin, and whatever your DAW is. In Ableton, it's called utility, and you don't have to do the volume adjustment within the plugin if it doesn't offer it. You can do it here right after that plugin in the chain, right? So we can turn off that adjustment, group these, okay? And each DAW is a little bit different, but you can achieve this in the same way. And so now when I turn off and on this group, it's turning on the EQ and turning down the volume by 6. So we're getting that same volume adjustment. And so you might have to do this manually sometimes using a utility plugin or some type of volume plugin, depending on what plugin you're using. But no matter how you do it, just make sure that you are adjusting for the volume difference that whatever processing you're doing to the sound is making. So I'll just show you this now. Again, same concept. We're hearing it get brighter from the EQ. We're not just hearing it get louder. So while we're here on this sound, I'll show you another cool thing that some plugins offer in the way of volume adjustment. So if I pull up FabFilter has a great, we'll pull up a Pro Q again. In FabFilter plugins, you can go here to this auto, within the EQ, you can go to this auto gain feature. This is represented by the A. And if you read here, you could read it, on your own time. But what it does is it tries to do this process for you, right? So it measures, it takes into account the volume change that happens when you make a move like that. And it turns up or down the output volume automatically for you to try and compensate for the moves that you're making. This isn't always 100% accurate, but it's a good start when you're in a hurry. And if it sounds good, it is good, right? But make sure, even if you're using this automatic feature within FabFilter plugins, that you're still, don't just rely on this, because it can not be perfect as well. But if you're going quick, you're in the creative phase of your production process, it's not a bad feature to rely on. I'll just show you also a couple of other plugins that have similar sort of auto features like that, so that you can keep that in mind. If I pull in the FabFilter Pro C2, this is a compressor. You see how by default it has this auto gain on. What this does is, within the context of compression, if I adjust this threshold, it's going to try its best to keep the gain the same. Take a look. So you'll see how it's peaking about the same level on the input and the output. If I turn the auto gain off, I'm going to have a quieter output because of the gain reduction that I'm getting on this compressor. You'll see I'm -12 on the input, -25 on the output, because I'm getting so much gain reduction. if I turn the auto gain back on, it'll adjust that for me again. Okay, so what if your compressor doesn't have auto gain? Same thing, right? So we're gonna look for how much gain reduction we're getting. About 15, and we can turn this up by 15. This should be approximately the same input and output levels because we're compensating for that amount of gain reduction, just like we did on the master channel with that SSL waves compressor. So you'll see I made a little bit of an adjustment there until I see that the peaks are peaking around the same point. Now we can hear, again, what the plugin is doing and not just the volume change. One other quick example, this is common in saturation plugins. I will, actually let me use, I don't know if the Ableton Saturator has this, but there's a Sound Toys plugin called Decapitator. And it has an interesting feature that you see in some other plugins as well, called Link. Oh, I guess it's not called Link, it's called Auto. But look what happens. As I turn the drive up on this saturator, the output knob also is turned down by the same amount. So this is a feature that's meant to do this compensation for you. If it's in auto mode, obviously if you turn off auto mode, you'd have to do it manually. Some plugins have a similar thing. Here, let's go to K-Clip. And again, just showing you some examples of what this might look like in various plugins so you can keep an eye on it when you're working in plugins you might not be that familiar with. If you click this link button, as I turn the in, it turns the output down because this is a clipper, but just like the other plugins are doing, it does that automatic sort of adjustment for you, or it tries its best to make sure that you're not getting biased because of the volume difference. So keep an eye on those type of features within your plugins. You know, if you're reading the manual or you're clicking around, if you see that, that's what these type of features are trying to help you avoid, is getting biased with that volume change. All right, so I want to show you guys one more component of this concept in the context more of mixing and mastering, and that is comparing your track to reference tracks. When you are comparing your track before it's mastered to commercially loud, mastered professional tracks, those tracks are going to be way louder than your track because your track hasn't gone through the mastering process yet. And so when you're comparing your mix, it's important to volume match your reference tracks as well. Otherwise, your ears are going to tell you, again, like we've been talking about, that the reference track is better. So for example, take a listen to this professional track that I use as a reference against the pre-master on a track of mine. And be careful, the reference track is a little loud compared to mine, so maybe just watch your ears for a moment. So as you can hear, it's kind of like one of those memes that we see where it's like your reference track, the reference track versus your track. My track sounds puny and weak and small right now compared to this reference track. It's like embarrassingly so, right? So the first thing, there's like two ways to go about this, and both are important to know. Obviously, the first thing is we can use our ears and just turn this volume knob down until they're sounding about the same volume, and then we're comparing apples to apples more. We'll do that kind of crude process first here. So you can tell now, obviously, when I've turned the reference track down, we're a little bit more in the same ballpark. My track doesn't sound so puny in comparison. Of course, when you're doing this, you also have to take into account, it's not just about peak volume though. It's also about loudness, right? So from like a RMS or LUFS perspective, their track is still louder than mine. And so if I pull on a limiter onto my track, I can push the gain into a limiter until I'm getting a similar loudness to my reference track. And I'm going to pull in a metering plugin. Let's see. I like this one. It's called BX Meter. Actually, I'll pull a copy of this onto each of these tracks. This tells us the RMS. Now, by the way, you don't have to use this BX Meter. This is just what I use. There are lots of free loudness measuring plugins out there. One that I see people use a lot is called Ulean Loudness Meter. I haven't used that one, but I know it's a common loudness meter that can do this same thing. But what this does is here on the left is my track. Here on the right is the reference track. I'm going to solo my track, and it's going to tell you here the RMS. That's the integrated loudness. It's different than the peak volume. It's again, like the LUFS, the loudness, the difference between the softest and loudest parts of the audio. And I'm going to start pushing gain into the limiter until I'm getting an RMS that is similar to the reference track. Okay, so you can see the reference, which was not playing, but it was peaking. The RMS was coming up to about 4.5, and I got my reference or my own track to be about that same loudness. So now I can actually put this back to 0 because I should be hitting around the same level of loudness with the reference track now that I've turned my gain up using that limiter. So now I should be peaking, we should both be peaking at 0, but my loudness will be the same, and we can now compare the tracks a lot more closely to each other in the same way. So check this out. You see what I mean? So now that I have got a similar RMS, which is the way that we measure quote unquote loudness, we're really now comparing apples to apples, and I can tell that my mix is stacking up against that the professional mix. Now, as we go through the mastering process, we want to keep an eye on this. Every plugin that we add in our mastering chain is going to make things louder. It's going to change the volumes. So I'm going to be keeping an eye as I go through, and if I were to master my track, I would be keeping an eye on the RMS against my reference track the entire time, making sure that, for one, I'm similarly loud, and also for two, that I'm getting as loud, right? That's another component that we've talked about in other videos. We want to stack up from a loudness perspective against other tracks. But in today's video, we're really focusing on when we're comparing our track and the tonal balance and the mix down to a reference track, we want to compare them at a similar loudness, not only with regard to peak volume, but also with regard to RMS, LUFS, and sort of integrated loudness measurements. All right, so as you guys can see, it can be really easy to trick yourself into thinking something sounds better just because it's louder. So as you're going through your process of producing and you're applying processing to individual sounds, even during the sound design, and sound processing phase, but also as you go up through mixing and mastering, always take that moment to ask yourself and just double check that the processing that you're applying isn't changing the volumes. This is something that over time will become second nature, and you can continually ensure that you're not tricking yourself into thinking that something's better just because it's louder. You can make sure that the moves you're making are intentional and actually benefiting your song from a sonic perspective, not just volume. All right, guys, so keep this one in mind, and I will see you in the next video. Peace.